because I look like trash, and I did even then. I was never like that, but I got my business sense from my dad. I think I got that strength.
She never heard the words, not when she bought him a house, not when her songs reached every corner of the globe. But years after her rise from poverty to stardom, Dolly Parton discovered that the father who never learned to read had quietly delivered her books across Tennessee, telling strangers, "My daughter's doing this." It was the kind of pride he never spoke aloud, but that she had chased all her life. And to understand why that silent gesture meant more than platinum records or standing ovations, you have to begin where her voice was first born. In a one-room cabin wrapped in frost and silence, buried deep in the Smoky Mountains. The Girl from the Mountains. Long before the spotlight and rhinestones, there was only cold air and cracked floorboards. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in a one-room cabin in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, a sliver of land tucked deep in the Smoky Mountains. She was the fourth of 12 children, and everything about their life was defined by lack. No electricity, no running water, and no insulation against the brutal Appalachian winters. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, worked as a sharecropper and laborer. He couldn't read or write, but he carried the weight of the family on his back, returning each day with hands stained by tobacco fields and silent frustration. Her mother, Avi Lee, stitched together clothes from flour sacks and sang to her children when hunger outlasted the food. Dolly's earliest memories weren't just of scarcity, they were of songs. Her mother's lullabies blended with gospel hymns from her grandfather's Pentecostal sermons. These sounds weren't background noise, they were survival. By the time Dolly was 7, she was writing her own lyrics, scratching out rhymes on scraps of paper using broken pencils. When she performed her first songs on local radio at 10, she wasn't chasing fame, she was reaching for air. Music wasn't a dream, it was the only way out. But at school, that world didn't matter. She was mocked for her clothes, her accent, and her dirt-streaked hands. She once said she didn't even know she was supposed to feel ashamed of being poor until she saw how the other children looked at her. That shame became a scar she learned to carry in silence, one that would eventually fuel every line she ever wrote. Nashville and the fight to be heard. In 1964, with high school barely behind her and a cardboard suitcase in hand, Dolly boarded a Greyhound bus to Nashville. She was 18, alone, and carrying $20 and a guitar. But what she brought most of all was certainty, that her voice, sharp as mountain wind and warm as sun on tin, could change everything. Nashville, however, was not waiting. She arrived into a city built on dreams, but held together by gatekeepers. The music executives she met dismissed her before she sang a note. They told her she was too country for country music, her voice too high-pitched, her look too flashy. She lived in a cramped apartment crawling with roaches, scraping by on packets of ketchup and saltines stolen from diners. Days were spent knocking on studio doors. Nights were for writing lyrics about people who never listened. And when she was finally allowed to sing, she gave them everything. She poured hunger, memory, and shame into her songs. But the response was always the same: shrugs, smirks, indifference. One executive laughed and told her to go back to the mountains. Another said Nashville didn't need another nobody. Each rejection echoed what she'd heard all her life: you don't belong here. Still, she stayed. She took demo jobs, cleaned offices, did whatever would keep the lights on. She wasn't just trying to make it, she was trying not to disappear. Then, in 1966, she signed with Monument Records. It wasn't a dream offer, but for the first time, her name would be printed on a record sleeve. The girl they tried to erase was about to start writing her name into country music history. The Cajun Rhinestones. By 1967, Dolly Parton had a small record deal, a modest hit, and a whole city still betting against her. Then came the call that changed everything. Porter Wagoner, a well-known country star with a nationally syndicated television show, needed a new female co-host. He chose Dolly. To millions of Americans, it looked like her big break. And on paper, it was. Each week, she stood beside Porter in glittering rhinestone dresses, harmonizing before glowing audiences. Their chemistry seemed effortless. Her fame grew, Her songs climbed charts, and her face became familiar across the country. But what the audience didn't see was that the stage she stood on was also a cage. Porter became more than a mentor. He became a manager, a gatekeeper, and, eventually, a barrier. The contract she signed gave him control over her bookings, recordings, and royalties. He took a large share of her earnings and vetoed songs she wrote from her own soul. When she pushed back, arguments erupted, behind dressing room doors and between takes. He reminded her constantly that without him, she was nothing, and part of her feared he was right. Still, she kept writing. In secret, she penned the song that would become her quiet rebellion, I Will Always Love You. It wasn't a romantic goodbye. It was her farewell to the man who made her career and almost broke her spirit. In 1974, after 7 years beside Porter, she finally sang it to him. Her voice shook with sorrow, but also with resolve. He wept, but he let her go. What followed was not just liberation, it was risk. She was leaving behind the biggest platform she'd ever had, stepping into the unknown without financial safety or industry support. But for the first time, her voice belonged only to her. Reinvention and relentless success. Freedom came at a cost. Dolly was no longer tethered to Porter Wagoner, but she walked away with debt, uncertainty, and a music industry watching to see if she'd vanish. Instead, she released I Will Always Love You as a solo single, and it soared to #1. For the first time, the world saw her not as someone's sidekick, but as an artist in her own right. Over the next few years, she shattered expectations. Jolene, with its haunting melody and emotional precision, cemented her songwriting genius. In 1977, Here You Come Again became her first true pop crossover hit, reaching a whole new audience without letting go of her roots. Then in 1980, she wrote and starred in 9 to 5, a film about workplace inequality that felt both personal and universal. The theme song became an anthem for millions, driven by typewriter rhythms, witty lyrics, and the grit of a woman who had lived every word. But behind the scenes, the pace was brutal. Dolly was working constantly, touring, recording, filming, building her brand. Her face was everywhere, but her time belonged to no one. The higher she climbed, the more fragile her foundation became. She later admitted that she feared stopping, even for a moment. Rest felt like the edge of a cliff. Her success was no longer in question, but peace remained elusive. Though she had claimed her independence, the spotlight brought its own kind of confinement, and beneath the sequins, something was quietly unraveling. Mental health and fragility. By the mid-1980s, Dolly Parton's name was synonymous with success. But success, as she would later reveal, nearly cost her everything. While fans saw a radiant performer lighting up concert halls and film screens, Dolly was battling a darkness she could barely articulate, a deep depression that crept in silently and took hold with alarming force. She had ignored the warning signs for years: constant exhaustion, emotional numbness, and the gnawing guilt over time lost with her husband, Carl Dean. Despite their lasting bond, their marriage had often been stretched by absence and fame. Dolly admitted in rare interviews that she felt more married to her work than to the man who had loved her quietly from the beginning. And in that quiet, the loneliness grew unbearable. At her lowest point, she contemplated ending it all. One day, sitting alone with a loaded gun, she felt herself sliding toward the edge. But then, in what she later described as divine timing, her little dog came running into the room. Its eyes were filled with concern, its tail wagging with unknowing love. That simple moment, an innocent gaze from a creature who needed her, was enough to stop her. In that moment, as the dog looked up at her with unknowing loyalty, something fragile and human broke through the despair. She couldn't pull the trigger, not when there was still one living soul in the world who needed her. That single flicker of connection pulled her back from the brink. She sought therapy, leaned on close friends, and began the painful process of healing. The woman who had carried entire worlds in song had nearly been undone by silence. But from the wreckage, she began to rebuild, not as a star, but as a survivor. The legacy he never spoke. For most of her life, Dolly Parton waited for something that never came in words. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a man shaped by silence, poverty, and pride that never learned how to speak itself aloud. He loved his daughter deeply, but affection in their world was practical, not verbal. Even as Dolly bought her parents a home, lifted her family out of hardship, and became a global icon, she rarely heard the sentence she longed for most: "I'm proud of you." Years later, long after fame had settled into routine, Dolly learned the truth in a quieter way. Her father, who never learned to read or write, had taken a special interest in her imagination library, the program that mailed free books to children. Without fanfare or attention, he helped deliver books across Tennessee, proudly telling neighbors and strangers alike that his daughter was giving children what he never had: literacy, opportunity, a beginning. For a man whose life had been defined by limitation, this was his language of pride. He could not praise her in speeches or interviews, but he could carry books into homes like the one he raised her in. When Dolly realized this, it reframed everything she thought she had missed. The approval she chased for decades had been there all along, spoken through action instead of words. Dolly Parton was never chasing monuments. She was building bridges. From a frostbitten cabin to millions of homes filled with music, books, and hope, she showed that real legacy is what you give away. If this story moved you, leave a like, share her journey, and subscribe for more untold lives that shape the world.